I never thought the beginning of something irreversible would come so quietly. No thunder in the sky, no dramatic pause in the air, just the soft rustling of linen napkins on the table and the familiar clinking of cutlery. He sat across from me, just one more guest at a family dinner, one more face around the fire pit in our backyard. But there was something in the way his eyes lingered. Not on me, exactly, but around me, like he was scanning for something forgotten and found it in my presence. The dinner was ordinary. My husband was his usual charismatic self, leaning back, in his chair, laughing a little louder than necessary. Our son scrolled through his phone, offering polite nods when spoken to. The drowsy twilight, the scent of grilled vegetables, the wine that was just a little too sweet. It should have been. A typical summer evening, but my skin prickled beneath the thin silk of my dress. I wore that dress not for anyone else, but because I needed to remember myself. The woman I once was before wife and mother overtook name and voice, a soft beige slip dress with open shoulders. Underneath, lace that only I would see, black and delicate like burnt sugar, just to remind myself I still could. He complimented the wine. That was all. Just a murmur, a tilt of the head, a look through half-lidded eyes. But something in his tone scratched under my skin, distant and unplaceable, but not unfamiliar. We were never close. My husband's uncle, technically, though the age gap between them narrowed that space, he'd been away for years, working overseas, and had returned after what I'd understood to be some sort of quiet burnout. But he seemed calm, grounded, observant. In a way my husband hadn't been for years. After dinner, the men lingered outside. My husband opened another bottle, and I excused myself to the kitchen. I needed to move. My body felt tight, my chest fuller than usual, my breath slower. It wasn't attraction, not yet. It was something like curiosity mixed with the faintest drop of hunger, emotional, maybe, chemical, possibly, but real. I washed the same plate twice. Through the open window, I heard them talking, laughing, the rhythm of masculine comfort between family. Then his voice cut through, low and solitary. She looks tired. I froze. The sponge in my hand stopped mid-motion. My husband replied something unintelligible and laughed again, but the echo of that simple sentence dug into me. It wasn't said in pity. It wasn't said for praise. It was said in observation. And I couldn't remember the last time someone looked close enough to notice my fatigue. Later, I found myself by the patio, collecting glasses. He stepped back to let me through, his fingers briefly brushing my elbow. An accident. Entirely explainable. But I felt it. That bare touch against bare skin felt like the first moment of a slow unraveling. I looked at him. He didn't apologize. Didn't flinch. He just looked at me, one brow slightly raised, and offered the smallest smile, as if he already knew I had noticed the moment as much as he had. That night, after the guests had left, I lay beside my husband, listening to him breathe in rhythmic, shallow waves. His hand lay across his chest, fingers twitching slightly in sleep. I stared at the ceiling, wide awake. I reached down and felt the lace edge of my underwear still in place, untouched. The thought was uninvited, but it settled inside me like a secret I couldn't shake. I wanted to be touched, not out of duty or routine, not to complete a rhythm, but because someone saw me, not the wife, not the mother, but the woman underneath the silk and lace. I didn't sleep. My mind looped through that moment, his eyes, that single comment, the brush of his hand. Nothing had happened, and yet something had shifted, like a pane of glass slightly, tilted in its frame, not broken, but no longer fitting as it once had. By morning, I expected the feeling to pass. I expected to scold myself for the flutter in my chest, or the heat low in my belly. I expected shame. But what I felt instead was anticipation, and when I heard that he'd be staying in town for a few more weeks, and that my husband had invited him to the lake house for the weekend, I didn't protest. I asked if we had enough guest towels. I baked an extra pie. I even cleaned the back patio myself in a blouse that dipped just a little lower than it needed to. I told myself I was just being polite, hospitable. But something in me knew better. I wasn't preparing the house. I was preparing myself. It started with a forecast. clouds that gathered by mid-morning and hung low like a held breath. My husband loved this kind of weather. Cool, overcast, promising rain but rarely delivering it. He said it made the lake house feel like a secret place. To me, it just meant I could wear long sleeves and still feel the silk graze my skin. We arrived just after lunch. My husband carried bags, humming tunelessly. Our son had opted out of the trip at the last minute, claiming study obligations. And I felt a guilty relief. Fewer eyes, fewer risks, fewer threads to hold together. The lake house sat where the trees thinned and the water opened up like glass. It was built for quiet, soft chairs, thick carpets, windows that reached for the sky. I knew every creak in its floors, every uneven tile in the guest bathroom. But that day it felt unfamiliar, slightly altered, like someone had rearranged the furniture in my memory. He arrived in the late afternoon. Same travel bag he always carried, same too casual way of moving. But his eyes found mine the moment he stepped through the door. Not in greeting, in search, I noticed it, and I didn't look away. Dinner was slow and drawn out, full of wine and lazy conversation. The men talked about old road trips and mutual friends I didn't know. I smiled where I should, laughed where it was expected. But my attention drifted, first to his voice, then to the way his hand moved when he poured his drink, then to the silence between his words. He spoke less than usual. He watched more. I wore a thin, charcoal gray sweater dress, soft enough to be forgiving, tight enough to be noticed. Beneath it, nothing delicate, nothing lace, just smooth satin, dark and firm, the kind that hugged the skin and made me feel like I had secrets under every layer. After dinner, my husband offered to show him the newly installed sauna behind the house. They walked out together, voices fading. I cleaned up slowly, alone in the kitchen, savoring the solitude like a forbidden dessert. The silence stretched. And when I finally stepped out onto the deck, he was there, alone. My husband had gone to bed early, leaving him with a half-finished drink and a distant look. He didn't turn when I approached, just said softly, "You still like storms?" I paused. "Only if I'm dry," he smiled, eyes still on the lake. "Then you should stay under this roof tonight." It wasn't flirtation, it wasn't innuendo, it was something heavier, older, like we were borrowing words from a conversation that had started years before and had only now caught up to us. The night was colder than I expected. I felt it in the tips of my fingers. Maybe that's why I didn't move when he reached for my hand. His touch was deliberate. Not hesitant. Not bold, just certain. He turned finally and looked at me fully. There was no smile, no pretense, just the shared knowledge of where we were and what this was becoming. "I'm not going to ask," he said, "because if I do, you'll walk away." I should have backed into the doorway, made some excuse about the cold or the hour or propriety. But instead I stayed, even as he leaned closer, even as the air between us seemed to pulse with something unnamed. And then it happened, not rushed, not stolen. A kiss that wasn't about possession but recognition, like tracing a shape your hands already knew but had forgotten. His lips were warm. His mouth tasted faintly of the wine we'd shared. His fingers brushed the base of my neck, and something inside me, long buried under routine and decorum, cracked open. There was no moan, no whispered names, just the quiet rhythm of breath against breath and the sound of my pulse echoing behind my ears. I didn't move when it ended. I didn't speak, neither did he. He stepped back first, barely, enough to leave space but not enough to break whatever we had just created. Then I turned and walked away, slowly, deliberately, each step grounded. Careful, not from guilt, but from knowing this was not a moment to erase. In the bedroom, I undressed in silence. My husband was asleep, back turned. I slipped beneath the covers, my skin still tingling where his fingers had rested. I closed my eyes, expecting regret. Instead, I felt awake. More than I had in years, the kind of awake that sees through the darkness. The kind that doesn't sleep at all. And when I woke in the gray light of dawn, lips still remembering, I didn't question what had begun. I only wondered how soon I could feel it again. The morning passed without mention. No glance, no brush of fingertips, no coded exchange across the breakfast table. And yet, every gesture felt laced with memory. My husband stirred his coffee beside me, unaware that my body was still humming with the imprint of someone else's mouth. I nodded along to small talk, held the ceramic cup steady in my hand, and forced my voice into even tones as I responded. But inside, something unraveled. Not in fear, not even in guilt. It was a quiet, steady dissolution of everything I thought I knew about the limits I'd built for myself. We stayed at the lake house an extra day. My husband insisted. It would do us good, he said, to get away from everything. He didn't know how right he was. The irony of his suggestion settled in my chest like a pebble, cold and absurd. By midday, the three of us were hiking up a narrow trail behind the property, where the forest thickened and the air cooled. My boots sank into soft soil, and the sweat along my spine made my shirt cling tighter with every step. They walked ahead of me, exchanging stories. Their voices echoed faintly between the trees. I walked slower, pretending to admire the view, though in truth I needed space. My mind was loud, filled with the pressure of restraint. He didn't look back once. But when we stopped to rest at the overlook, he handed me a bottle of water without speaking, and his fingers lingered just long enough against mine to send a current through my arm. It was subtle, invisible to any observer, and yet to me it felt louder than any confession. Later, we returned to the house. My husband took a call, work, something urgent, and disappeared into the upstairs office, the door clicking shut behind him. I was alone in the kitchen again, sleeves rolled, washing the bowls from lunch. The water ran hot, the steam fogging the lower edge of the window above the sink. And then I heard the steps, not hurried, not cautious, just steady. He stood behind me, just out of reach. I didn't turn. Instead, I said, "You're quiet today." His reply was low, deliberate. "You're not." I turned the water off but didn't move otherwise. The silence stretched between us like wire, tense, waiting to snap. Finally, he said, "He doesn't see it. Any of it." I closed my eyes. The sink still dripped. A soft, rhythmic sound that anchored me. "He's not cruel," I said. "He just doesn't know how to look anymore." There was a long pause before he responded. "You shouldn't have to remind someone you exist." That truth settled heavily in my stomach, and yet it wasn't new. It was the same truth I'd been swallowing in small doses for years, bitter and familiar. Then, from upstairs, my husband's voice broke the moment. On the phone, laughing, discussing budgets or deliveries or whatever demanded his full attention. While I stood below, trembling from a simple sentence, we separated then. He to the guest room to shower, I to the porch to breathe. I sat with a blanket over my knees, watching the wind ripple across the surface of the lake. My thoughts circled around me like birds of prey, never landing, never letting me rest. That evening, when my husband asked if we'd like to take the boat out for sunset, I hesitated. He was already gathering the keys, eager to create some memory that might stitch us back together. I played my role, smiled, grabbed my cardigan, and when we reached the water, I sat beside him, our thighs just barely touching on the bench seat. But I didn't feel his body. I felt the absence of the one that made mine pulse. The boat cut through the glassy surface, leaving a white wake behind us like a scar. He talked about renovations. He wanted to do how we should repaint the guest room, maybe extend the dock. I nodded. I said the right things. But then I turned, I met the eyes of the man across from me, and in that split second, my breath left me. There was no smile, just the smallest tilt of his head, as if to say, "You feel it too?" And I did. Later that night, after dinner, the men sat out with whiskey while I showered. The steam clung to my skin, and I took my time. My body felt more like mine than it had in years. Not because I was claimed, but because I was seen. I stepped out into the hallway, hair still damp, wearing nothing but a simple navy robe. The house was quiet. And then I heard them talking. My husband and him. I leaned toward the staircase, keeping my steps silent. "She's changed," my husband said. "I don't know how to explain it. She's quieter, but not in a bad way. Almost sharper. Like She's watching everything. A pause. Then, his voice. Maybe she's finally waking up. I froze. My heart beat loud enough to drown the world. He wasn't defending me. He wasn't betraying me. He was naming me, calling me into existence. And that was the moment I knew it was no longer a question of if. It had already happened. Not the kiss, not the moment on the porch, but the shift, and nothing was going to stop it now. We returned to the city. On a Monday, the weather broke into sunlight that felt unearned, as if the world insisted on being bright while I carried a storm under my skin. The car ride was filled with silence that passed for normalcy. My husband drove, humming under his breath, occasionally pointing out landmarks we'd passed hundreds of times. I answered with automatic smiles, nods, the well-rehearsed sound of a woman who had nothing on her mind. But inside, I was sorting through pieces I couldn't yet name. My thoughts weren't linear. They moved like smoke. Sometimes I replayed the kiss in the cold air by the lake. Other times I returned to the tone of his voice when he spoke to my husband, low, steady, betraying nothing and yet full of everything. For 3 days I didn't see him, not because I avoided him and not because we agreed on any distance, just life happening as it always does. Obligations, errands, calls from family, groceries to restock. My body moved through routine like a song on repeat. But I noticed things I hadn't before. The way my husband touched my shoulder in passing but didn't linger. The way he shared space without occupying it. The way my body flinched, not from dislike, but from absence. Wednesday evening, I got a message. Not a call, not a question. Just, I'll be at that old book cafe near the university, around 7. If you come, you come. I stared at it longer than necessary, reading between its clean, deliberate lines. He wasn't playing a game. He wasn't asking me to choose. He was making space. That made it more dangerous than anything else. I dressed slowly, nothing too loud, a simple wrap dress, forest green, slightly open at the collar. I didn't choose lace. Not this time, just soft cotton underneath, comforting and thin, enough to feel everything through. I left my hair down, walked out before my husband returned from work, and told no one where I was going. The cafe was nearly empty when I arrived. Muted jazz playing, the smell of paper and espresso soaked into the floorboards. He sat near the back, away from the windows, his coat slung over the back of his chair. No greeting, just a glance as I approached and a seat pulled out with the kind of ease that made it feel inevitable. We didn't speak right away. He ordered for me. I let him. For several minutes, we just sat there, drinking, breathing, watching each other through the cover of small movements, his hand resting near mine, my thumb grazing the cup's rim, his leg angled just close enough to remind me we were no longer in neutral territory. Then he said quietly, "This isn't new for you, is it?" I didn't answer. Not because it wasn't true, but because it was. On a level I didn't understand until that moment. This wasn't about one man, or even one decision. It was about years of shrinking, about silences mistaken for peace, about loneliness hidden behind well-pressed dresses and family vacations. He leaned in slightly. "You don't have to explain, I'm just here." It was that calm certainty again, the one I both craved and resented. He didn't want to rescue me. He didn't want to be told what I felt. He just wanted to be the one I allowed to see it. Outside, the light began to fade. I didn't look at the clock. Time wasn't relevant anymore. He asked me if I wanted to leave. Not to go anywhere, just leave. The cafe, the public space, the place where we were still pretending. I nodded. We stepped into the night. Cold. Air brushed against my skin, and I felt that same tension from the lake, alive again. His car was parked a block away. We walked in silence, side by side, hands not touching, bodies barely close, but charged. Every breath we took felt like it was borrowed from a world we hadn't dared enter until now. At the car, he opened the door for me. I paused before getting in, half hoping he would pull me back against him. He didn't. He simply waited until I sat down, then closed the door gently, walked around, and took the driver's seat. He didn't start the engine right away. We sat, breath visible in the glass, the hum of the street behind us, the future suspended. He turned to me. There was no speech, no plea, No drama, just a question in his eyes, and I answered it by leaning in. The second kiss wasn't tentative. It wasn't exploratory, it was a claim, made softly, reverently, but with the weight of inevitability. His hands didn't rush. They rested, one at the base of my neck, the other over my ribs, just beneath my arm, where the dress met skin. I felt it all, the roughness of his palm, the cold from the window glass, the way my body leaned into him, not from desperation, but from recognition. My mind didn't wander. I wasn't thinking of my husband. I wasn't thinking of anything. I was there, and I didn't want to leave that moment, but I did. I pulled back first, not because I regretted it, but because I needed to feel what it was like to choose the pause, not the end. He didn't ask for more. I opened the door and stepped out without a word. I walked the block back to my car, breath shallow, hand shaking, not from fear, but from the energy still echoing through me. When I got home, the house was quiet. My husband was in his study, typing something. He looked up, smiled, asked how my walk had been. I kissed him on the forehead and said, "Good." I went upstairs, undressed slowly, and stood before the mirror. My skin still tingled in places his hands had touched. Not marked, not bruised, just remembered. I lay in bed for a long time that night, staring into the dark. I thought I would cry or ache or plan, but I didn't. I only waited for the moment when the quiet inside me would return. It didn't. I don't know when exactly it changed from moments to momentum. Maybe it was the way I began checking my phone, not for messages from my husband or reminders from my son, but for the absence of a name that had never once appeared in my contacts. Maybe it was the way my eyes searched crowds in the grocery store or slowed passing a particular street corner. Or maybe it was the realization that when I touched my husband, out of habit, routine, gratitude, my body didn't respond. Not with revulsion, but with silence, as if a part of me had gone deaf to him. It was a week after the cafe when my husband announced, over dinner, that he wanted to host a small gathering. Just family. Just to reconnect. He said it with that casual tone he uses when he's already decided something, presenting it as if it's still up for discussion. I nodded, smiled, offered to take care of the cooking. I didn't ask for a guest list. I didn't have to. He arrived an hour after everyone else, claiming a delayed train. I'd already poured wine, arranged plates, guided conversations. I'd even kissed my husband on the cheek when he asked for the salt. The way I used to when we were newly married, back when everything we did still felt like a choice. And then I heard his voice in the hallway. Quiet, rough around the edges, like it carried the weight of places he'd been that no one here had. Asked about. I didn't go to greet him. I stayed in the kitchen, hands folded, watching the reflection of the entryway and the microwave door. And when he walked past, he didn't look at me directly, but his hand brushed the edge of the counter, slow and deliberate. My heart climbed up into my throat, and I had to remind myself to breathe. He sat at the far end of the table. We were surrounded by conversation, my husband talking about real estate, my sister-in-law laughing too loudly about her dog, my father-in-law sipping wine like it was his only job. The table was full, but I felt only one pair of eyes. I didn't drink much, just enough to soften the edges of restraint. When dessert came out, I excused myself to the hallway, claiming a forgotten serving tray. I didn't expect him to follow. I hoped he wouldn't. He did. It was the corridor between the kitchen and the guest bedroom. Narrow, dim, with a soft creak in the second floorboard from the left. I turned, and he was already too close. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The kiss was nothing like the others. It was hungrier, desperate, but not chaotic. His hands gripped my waist, not to pull me closer, but to hold me still, as if I might vanish. My fingers clutched the fabric of his coat like I could anchor us both to that one moment. The hallway was silent, save for our breath and the muted clatter of plates. Somewhere in the dining room, his mouth moved along my neck. My hands found the side of his face, fingers against the unshaven line of his jaw. My body felt like it was burning through the skin, alive in places I'd forgotten how to feel. We pulled apart only because the sound of footsteps reached us. A burst of laughter from down the hall broke the air between us like a stone through glass. I turned away first, fixing my blouse with shaking fingers. He stepped back into the shadow as easily as he'd stepped forward. Back at the table, no one noticed. Or if they did, they said nothing. Later, after the last guest had left, my husband wrapped an arm around me in the kitchen. He smelled of wine and cologne and warmth. He pressed his lips gently to my temple and whispered, "Thank you. That was perfect." I nodded. He didn't notice the way I flinched when his lips touched my skin, or maybe he did and chose not to say anything. The line between ignorance and mercy is thinner than most people realize. That night in bed, he reached for me. It wasn't often anymore, but when it did happen, I always gave in. Not because I wanted to, not because I didn't, but because I didn't know what else to do with the space between us. His hands moved with practiced rhythm. My body responded with practiced patience. I tried to be present. I tried to feel it the way I used to when it mattered, but all I could think about was the kiss in the hallway, the warmth still trapped in my hips, the ache he had left behind. When it was over, he kissed my shoulder and rolled away. I lay awake, for a long time, staring at the crack in the ceiling where the plaster had chipped, tracing it like a map. Somewhere inside, I felt something shift, not remorse, not even doubt, but fear, because I no longer wanted to stop, because I had never felt more alive, and because I knew I would see him again, soon, because this time, I would be the one reaching out. I waited 3 days before I reached out, not because I needed time to think, but because I needed time to prepare. There's a difference. I told myself that I wasn't becoming careless, that I still had control, but the truth is, the more I waited, the more I realized I was no longer trying to make sense of what we were doing. I was only trying to manage how far I'd let it go before it consumed everything else. There was no return to how things had been, only a careful balancing of what still remained. The message I sent was brief, mechanical. I asked if he'd be free sometime this week for coffee, a casual line, a line that could have been sent to anyone, but we both knew what it meant. He replied within minutes. One word, yes. The place wasn't the same cafe. That would have been too obvious, too easy. Instead, I suggested a bookstore I used to visit when I was younger, tucked in between two quiet streets on the edge of town. It had a narrow back room they used for reading events and weekend poetry nights. I knew no one would be there on a weekday morning. That was the point. When I arrived, he was already inside, standing near the far corner, a book in his hand, but not reading, just waiting. His presence had become familiar in a way that unnerved me, like a song I hadn't realized I'd memorized. I approached in silence. He didn't speak. He simply lifted his gaze, closed the book, and gestured toward the back. There were no other patrons, no distractions, just rows of faded shelves and the scent of paper and something older, almost like dust mixed with ink. The moment the door closed behind us, I felt the heat rise in my chest. It wasn't anticipation, it was relief, that I didn't have to pretend here, that whatever existed between us didn't need to wear polite disguises. He stepped closer, slower this time, measured, as if reading my pace, as if letting me be the one to decide, so I did. I reached up, not just to touch him, but to feel that I could, to prove to myself that this wasn't a mistake of passion or loneliness, but a choice, mine. Our kiss this time was different again. It wasn't hesitant or frantic. It was slow, controlled. His hands moved along my waist, grounding me, I felt. The pressure of his fingers through the thin fabric of my blouse, the heat of his breath against my neck, and for a long, suspended second, I forgot everything outside that room existed. Then I pulled away, just slightly. He looked at me without speaking, and I realized it wasn't about wanting more. It was about understanding what this already meant. There was a long pause before I finally whispered, "I don't know who I am when I'm with you." His response came slowly. "Maybe that's who you've been the whole time." The room felt smaller after that, not claustrophobic, intimate. The walls held our silence. Like they understood it, I sat on the small bench beneath the window, legs crossed, hands in my lap, trying to regulate my breath. He didn't come closer this time. He sat across from me, elbows on knees, watching. He said, You're afraid I'll ruin you. I shook my head. I'm afraid I already let you. We sat like that for a while, not touching, not speaking. The kind of silence that says everything when I finally stood. I didn't ask when we'd see each other again. I didn't need to, but I knew something had shifted. Not between us, but around us. That evening, I met my friend for coffee. Someone I hadn't seen in weeks. We spoke about family, the chaos of everyday life. She mentioned how tired I looked, how I seemed quieter, more distant lately. I smiled and brushed it off. Then she leaned forward, tapping her nail against the rim of her mug, and said, "Be careful." I froze. She didn't say it with judgment. There was no accusation, just observation, and a kind of tired knowing in her eyes. I said nothing, just nodded. When I returned home, my husband greeted me at the door, smiling, casual. He offered to cook dinner. We moved through the kitchen like dance partners who'd long since memorized each other's steps. I stirred the sauce. He opened a bottle of wine. He leaned in and kissed my shoulder lightly, then said, "You smell different." It wasn't suspicion, it wasn't concern, just a remark. I froze for a second, then answered, "I changed shampoos." He nodded, went back to slicing onions, but his silence afterward hung heavier than usual. That night, I lay in bed beside him, unable to sleep. His body radiated warmth, but it no longer reached me. I stared at the ceiling again, tracing that same crack in the plaster, and I thought of how different it felt, falling asleep next to someone who loved you out of habit, and kissing someone who saw you out of intention. I wasn't choosing between two men. I was choosing between versions of myself, and I didn't know yet which one I wanted to become. I began to exist in split seconds, between glances, between casual phrases, between the door opening and the moment it shut again. My life fractured into two realities, neither fully whole, both demanding silence. I wasn't just hiding anymore. I was balancing on a thread, stretched thinner with every breath. The first real crack came on a Sunday. We had planned a family lunch, just the three of us. My husband, my son, and me. It was one of those forced domestic traditions we clung to like a souvenir from better years. My husband grilled steaks, made jokes about overcooking them. My son barely looked up from his phone. I smiled, I laughed at the right cues, I passed the salad. Then I caught the way my son watched me. Just for a second. A look not of concern but calculation. He wasn't a child anymore. He knew how to read a room, and I knew instantly that he was reading me. Later, as I cleared the table, he stepped into the kitchen behind me. Not a word, just that same silent observation. I turned to say something, anything that would restore the casual rhythm of our roles, but he beat me. To it? Is there something going on with you? The question was too vague to accuse, too sharp to dismiss. I answered automatically. What do you mean? He shrugged, but the way he didn't look away made the shrug feel deliberate. I don't know. You're different. I turned back to the sink. My hands moved in water that had already gone cold. I felt his presence behind me like a weight, pressing into my spine. You'd tell me if something was wrong, he added, softer. I didn't turn. Of course. But I knew he didn't believe me. That night, the air inside the house felt off balance. My husband was unusually attentive, clearing dishes, offering to rub my shoulders, telling me he'd been thinking about taking time off for a short trip. Just the two of us. I nodded, murmured something agreeable, but my stomach turned with each word. It wasn't guilt. It was fear. Fear of being seen, because something was about to happen. I knew it, the way you know rain is coming. The pressure shifts, the stillness thickens, the world waits, and then came the invitation. My husband announced it casually, standing in the doorway of the bedroom as I folded laundry. My uncle's in town again. I thought we could invite him to the cabin this weekend. Just a few days quiet. No pressure. I kept folding. One towel, then another. My fingers moved on instinct. My heart did not. I said, "Sounds good." He didn't notice the pause before my answer, or if he did, he ignored it. By Friday, the plan was in motion. The drive was long, quiet, broken only by soft music and my husband's occasional musings about things he wanted to fix at the cabin. Loose shingles, The guest bathroom faucet. I answered when needed, watching the landscape blur past the window. The cabin stood where we had left it. Unchanged, isolated, too full of memories. I unpacked mechanically, placing sweaters into drawers, laying towels over bedposts. I moved like someone preparing for guests, though I already knew which guest mattered. He arrived in the late afternoon. Same manner, same voice, same subtle pull beneath the surface. We exchanged pleasantries, all three of us together, each word like a layer over the fire burning quietly beneath my skin. My husband suggested a walk before dinner. The three of us followed the trail around the lake, our boots pressing into wet earth. The wind moved through the trees like whispers. I stayed a few steps behind, close enough to hear their conversation, far enough to disappear into my thoughts. As we walked, I noticed my son had messaged me. Just a simple, "You okay?" It wasn't unusual, and yet I felt my chest tighten as I typed back a careful lie. Of course, just tired. I slid the phone away before I could see his response. After dinner, the men sat on the porch while I tidied the kitchen, through the open window. I could hear the low murmur of their voices, soft laughter, the clink of glasses. I let the water run longer than necessary, washing a plate that was already clean. When I stepped outside, he was alone. My husband had gone to bed. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply looked at me. It wasn't a look of longing. Not tonight. It was something deeper. Recognition. Maybe. Or resignation. I sat beside him, careful to leave space between us. My knees shook slightly, but I kept them still. The lake shimmered in the moonlight, and for a long time, that was all we watched. Then he whispered, "You should stop this." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because the truth was, I should. Every part of me understood that, morally, logically, but nothing in me wanted to. I turned to him, slowly. His jaw was clenched, eyes tight with restraint. "I think about you," I said, not as confession, but as fact. "I know." He stood abruptly, the chair scraping wood. But before he went inside, he turned back, one hand still gripping the doorframe. "This won't end well." And then he was gone. I sat there until the night grew cold, until the stars blurred, until the ache in my chest settled into something heavier, because I knew he was right, but I also knew I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. Morning found me awake. I listened to the sound of my husband shifting on the old bed beside me. His breathing was steady, almost childlike, the kind of breath that belongs to someone safe, someone at peace. Next to him lay a woman who hadn't felt peaceful in weeks. I stared at the ceiling and counted the cracks in the plaster, as if that might give me control over a life that no longer obeyed boundaries. I got up first. The house was quiet, heavy with that particular silence that feels deliberate. No creak of footsteps, no distant clatter of dishes, nothing to suggest life. He had gone for a run. I didn't need confirmation. I knew. His habits were etched into me before I ever dared whisper his name into the dark, precise, grounded, disciplined. I made coffee slowly, pouring the water in a thin, careful stream. The smell rose like memory, rich and bitter. I wrapped my hands around the mug and sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing in particular. Everything felt overexposed. My skin, my choices, my mind. I was raw in places I hadn't been aware existed. I didn't feel like I was breaking apart. I felt like I was being skinned alive, quietly and from within. He returned after 40 minutes, still damp with sweat, his breath slowing. He barely glanced in my direction, just nodded and poured himself a glass of water. There were no questions, no searching look, no acknowledgement of what had happened, or what hadn't, but that silence said more than any confrontation. All day, we moved like people performing a dance they'd rehearsed too many times. We trimmed hedges, cleaned the gutters, made plans. For dinner, my husband filled the space with his usual ease, talking, laughing, offering to fix things that didn't need fixing. I played my part, smiling, nodding, laughing at the appropriate beats. But my body was elsewhere, waiting, listening, burning. And then, as if scripted by some cruel joke, he suggested the sauna. It was an old one, tucked at the edge of the property, half hidden by tall pine trees. My husband waxed nostalgic about it, how it used to be his favorite part of the cabin, how we hadn't used it in years. "It'll be fun," he said. "The three of us, like the old days, before this, before my body forgot what it meant to want something just for myself." So I agreed. The sauna was small, wood-paneled, and smelled of damp cedar and years of sweat. By the time the fire got going, the steam had begun to rise, curling around the benches, fogging the tiny square window. My husband and he exchanged jokes, stories, pouring water over the rocks like two old friends pretending the world hadn't changed. I sat in the corner, wrapped in a towel, my skin already slick, the heat wrapped around me, pressing into my pores, lifting my pulse with each minute. It wasn't the temperature that made me dizzy, it was the proximity. Then, as expected, my husband excused himself. "Need to cool off," he said, stepping outside. And just like that, we were alone. The silence inside the sauna was almost sacred. No more jokes, no shifting, just the sound of my heartbeat in my ears, and the faint hiss of water evaporating on stone. I didn't look at him. I didn't have to. I could feel his stare like pressure against my shoulder, like his hands were already on me. And then his voice, low and quiet, like the steam itself. "You're not going to stop," a statement, not a question. I swallowed. The towel clung to my body, soaked and transparent. My skin felt too tight, like it no longer belonged to me. He didn't move, didn't touch me. But then he said, even quieter, "Then stop pretending it's an accident." It hit harder than any kiss, any touch, because it was true. This wasn't a slip. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't loneliness dressed up as rebellion. It was choice. 10 minutes later, the door creaked and my husband returned, laughing about how cold the lake breeze was. I smiled, reached for a new towel, and followed him out. He stayed behind. Later that night, when everyone had gone to bed, I crept outside barefoot. The wood planks of the deck were cool against my skin. I stared into the darkness surrounding the cabin. No stars, just the shape of trees in black silhouette, the outline of the sauna barely visible beyond the shadows, and in the window, a flicker of movement, a silhouette, still awake, still waiting. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. I didn't go to him that night. But I would. I woke before dawn. Though I hadn't truly slept, my body had begun to respond to this new rhythm. Half resting, half reaching. The quiet of the cabin wrapped around me like a fog. But inside, I felt sharpened, focused. I moved through. The house like a ghost, every step calculated, every sound noted. The stillness of early morning gave me clarity, the kind that only arrives once everything familiar has cracked open and reshaped itself into something you no longer recognize. My husband was still asleep. I watched the slow rise and fall of his chest, the way his fingers curled unconsciously toward the center of the bed. He looked peaceful, trusting, the kind of man who believed the world around him was still exactly as it had always been. I got dressed quietly. A loose shirt, soft jeans, no makeup, nothing meant to signal anything to anyone. But under the layers, I still chose a black bra. Simple, clean lines, no lace, but intentional. I didn't need seduction. I needed truth. And I was walking toward it. I found him outside, behind the shed, splitting wood. The rhythmic thud of the axe against the stump echoed across the empty yard. He didn't look up when I approached, just finished a swing, exhaled, wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. When he finally glanced at me, it wasn't surprise I saw. It was resignation, or maybe inevitability. We didn't speak. I stepped closer. My boots sank slightly into the damp earth. The wind caught a strand of my hair and dragged it across my cheek. His eyes followed the movement. My hand reached up, not to brush it away, but to give myself something to do before I lost the last of my restraint. He leaned the axe against the wall, slow, deliberate, and closed the distance between us in 3 steps. We didn't touch, not yet. We just stood there, close enough to feel each other's breath. The tension between us wasn't electric anymore. It was solid. It had weight, history, need. Then I said, barely audible, "I don't want to lie anymore." His voice was quieter than the wind. "Then don't." That was all. No declarations, no vows, just truth. Heavy and dangerous and real. The first touch wasn't desperate. It was reverent. His fingers brushed my wrist, slid up the length of my arm. I felt my knees soften. My eyes closed. And when his mouth found mine, it was with a precision that comes only from certainty. There was no more hesitation, no more rehearsal. We were not improvising. We were continuing. I felt the scratch of stubble against my jaw, the quiet exhale against my throat, the way his body curved around mine like it had been waiting for years. I responded without thought, without doubt, without fear, and yet, when it ended, when we finally pulled apart and stepped back, breathless but composed, there was no euphoria, no dizziness, only silence, a silence full of consequences. I turned first, not to run, but to return, because someone was waiting inside. The house, someone who still said my name without suspicion, who still made coffee for both of us, who still slept with his back slightly curled toward my side of the bed. Back inside, I found him setting the table. He looked up, smiled. "Breakfast?" he asked. I nodded, we sat, we ate. The eggs were too salty, but I didn't say anything. I couldn't taste them anyway. The weight of what I'd done, of what I continued to do, didn't feel like guilt. It felt like gravity, a pull I could no longer resist or explain, and yet, for the first time in weeks, I felt still, not at peace, but present. After breakfast, I stood by the window, staring out at the trees. My husband came up behind me, wrapped his arms around my waist. "We should come here more often," he said. "Just the two of us. No distractions." My body stiffened, not because of the words, but because I finally understood. I wasn't afraid of being caught. I was afraid of having to choose, because one day I would, and the worst part? I still didn't know which choice would be the betrayal.